to a city council decision. And we have with us Council Member Ryan Hunter. Good morning, Ryan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks for coming in. I want to jump right into this because our time is limited. The council decided to pull the conditional use permit for the Flathead Warming Center. You were one of 3 votes that said, no, we don't want to do that. Explain your vote to us.
Yeah, I really think it was a tragic decision for a couple of reasons. One, obviously the warming center is providing life-saving service for our community. They are providing 50 beds over winter, every night, saving lives. We did have homeless individuals in our community who were dying of exposure before the warming center opened, and they're ensuring that people have a warm, safe place to sleep at night who don't have housing. And we're going to lose that service if this decision holds. And I think that's absolutely tragic. I understand that the neighbors had a lot of concerns about what was going on in the neighborhood. They were real, they were serious. We absolutely should be addressing them, but this is absolutely the wrong way to go about doing it. And one other reason why I oppose it too is I just don't think it is legal. I think I looked at kind of the arguments in terms of the legality of it. I wasn't sold. I think there's a high probability that it will be overturned in the courts, and that will cost city taxpayers a lot of money.
So did you have an opportunity to argue those points with your other council members? I
did, yeah. Monday night I actually gave a fairly extensive presentation about my arguments about why I thought both it was not legal, at least my reading of it, and 2, because of the impact on the community and our homeless services. The warming center is actually a solution to the problem, not a perfect solution, not the only solution, but it is part of the solution, and we need to find a way to work with the warming center and other nonprofit partners to collaborate to find real solutions to the problem. And this was just really a distraction from that, and just absolutely the wrong way to go about doing it.
Can you kind of talk with us a little bit about the legalities of all this?
Yeah, so I think it gets into the weeds, so I'll try to keep it kind of top level. But okay. Basically, I think there was some confusion. My interpretation is that there's some confusion with the term conditional use permit. That word conditional, there was kind of a feeling among, I think, my fellow council members, if I am interpreting their perspective well enough, was that, that conditional in the conditional use permit is always kind of in effect, and you could kind of pull it at any time. That's not my understanding. Conditional use permit is part of our zoning. Zoning, there's things that are allowed outright. If you meet the zoning, you can build it, you can do it, and you don't need a permit on it. There's some permits where you just need to check some boxes. If you do these things, you get the permit. Conditional use permit is conditional in that when it comes to the council will decide to issue it or not, and as long as they have findings of fact, they can deny it. That's the conditional part. But once it's issued, and the conditions of that permit are met, which they were in the case of the warming center, it is done. It's a done deal. And one of the examples I provided during the meeting is it's very similar to like a housing development that you might permit. Once they build it and meet the conditions, you can't go in and decide, I really didn't like that housing development. Let's evict all the home buyers and make the developer come back and tear everything out and be done with it because we changed our mind. That's not how it works, and it doesn't work with conditional use permit either.
Well, this explains then the city attorney's letter to Tanya Horn accusing her of lying in the process and being untruthful. That's pretty rough.
It is pretty rough, and I strongly disagree with it. If you look at the application, what the issue was that they were speaking to. So the application, there were statements of fact and so forth, but there were also statements about their expected future outcome of the service and how it's going to impact the community. Now, those statements are neither true or false. They're just an opinion about the Warming Center was saying we have policies and procedures to in their words, prevent loitering, and have not a negative impact on the community. Now, what they couldn't anticipate was a few things. One, the COVID surge and people moving here, which resulted in a housing shortage and our rent prices spiking, which caused a lot of people to enter into homelessness. Two, we had, due to the state legislature cutting funding, the closure of mental health facilities in our community, which put a lot of people in the street and deprived them of resources to get mental health help. And then three, 2 long-term stay hotels, the Black and White and the Outlaw, closed, forcing all those folks out, and some of them winding up on our streets. So we had the surge of homelessness, not only just homelessness, but homeless of people who had severe mental health issues. And so we had problems community-wide as a result of that. Now, it just so happened all those things were happening just as the warming center was opening. So a lot of people saw those things, and they made the mistake of correlating it with the warming center, and a lot of myths and assumptions, false assumptions developed, such as that the warming center was attracting these people to the community or causing this problem, which really I don't think the facts bear out. And ultimately, the warming center has basically one tool to affect the neighborhood, which is if they can identify the person who is causing the problem in the neighborhood, they can deny them service. They say, you're not being a good neighbor, you're not being good in the community, you cannot sleep here at the warming center. But in order for them to do that, they need the name of the person or the identity. And that's their only tool. And nobody disputed that during the meetings. And what the warming center was saying, you can talk about the littering or the loitering, but unless somebody provides us with a name or identity, we can't do anything about it. And the attitude was kind of like, well, that's not good enough. And I don't understand, and I never understood, what exactly were they expecting the warming center to do to address this? It was kind of like they expected total control over the people who may or may not be coming to the warming center and their behavior once they leave the warming center property, which is absolutely unreasonable expectation. You just can't expect that.
One of the things that I think played into the council's decision, Monday morning, Sid Dowd, a fellow council member, was here, and he said, I was just disappointed that the warming center broke off the talks, the mediation talks with Mark Flateau. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Number one is that this issue of the expectations. They went into, and this is my understanding from things that they said and just interpreting some of the things I saw and so forth, is that they went into the first meeting and there was kind of these expectations. There were a lot of kind of the neighbors saying, you have to do this, this, and this, and all these demands that were really not reasonable, and they were not something the warming center could do. For example, hiring security and being basically the law enforcement presence in the neighborhood and enforcing the law. They are not a law enforcement agency. They don't have the resources to pay for private security to police that whole part of town. That's just unreasonable to expect of any one property owner. Yes, there are property owners who hire private security to patrol their property, but to patrol a whole part of town, that's totally unreasonable. And so they looked at the second meeting and they're like, this is going to be fruitless unless we have kind of a readjustment of expectations. And they didn't see that readjustment, so they were perfectly willing to meet and continue dialogue, but only if there was a kind of an understanding that these kind of pie in the sky requests were tempered. And the second thing I would say is kind of the legal end of it, which is that 60-day period should have been the step one. It should have been the first thing, rather than kind of coming down with a hammer and the threat of revoking the conditional use permit, which is basically a threat of extinction to the warming center. We should have started out the process of there's problems. Let's all collaborate. Let's all sit down, not only the neighbors in the warming center, but also the city. The city has the police force. The city has the parks department. The city has the resources to be a major player in real solutions here. We should have been at the table having that dialogue and not have that dialogue happen under the dark cloud of the threat of revoking the conditional use permit. And I think they got advice from their attorney that if it did go to court and they are agreeing to some of these demands, that may compromise their ability to defend themselves for the conditional use permit in court. That's my kind of from legal background speculation.
Well, we had, the opening salvos where people are coming here off of the railroad lines, and this is a soft landing spot. But when it kind of came to the fore was during the summer months when you saw a lot of homeless people camped out at Depot Park and that kind of a thing. The winter months, when it really provides a valuable life-saving service, is a different thing altogether. Do you have any kind of information on whether the major problem was around the warming center or was it elsewhere?
Yeah, to talk about that. So, there were kind of bigger issues in the winter when they were open in the summer, and so there is a link there. And obviously, if you take a social service agency and put them in a place where there is no social service agency, there is going to be an increase in kind of activity in that neighborhood. But it has to go somewhere, right? You can't, Meridian is an appropriate location. Anywhere you put it in the community, you're going to have neighbors that don't want it there. So it's kind of like there's no win situation there, but we need the service. And so it has to go somewhere. But ultimately, there was a lot of talk and discussion around police call volumes. We kind of had some police call volumes that were stand-ins for some of the problems that we were hearing. And it's not necessarily that all those calls were related to the warming center or were homeless people, but they served as kind of a approximation stand-in. And yes, there was kind of a bigger increase going from no warming center to a warming center in that neighborhood. But if you actually looked at the call volume, and this got missed a lot in the dialogue, is that all the other areas in the community that have homeless activity, we're talking about the library, the Depot Park, Woodland Park, around the jail, and around our other major homeless shelter, the Samaritan House, almost all of them had higher police call volume in total than did the warming center. The warming center actually had a lower volume. And that's something that, during the dialogue, it was kind of like, well, the warming center is the bad shelter, and the Samaritan House is the good shelter. Personally, I think they're both wonderful and they're providing incredible service. But actually, if you looked at the data, the warming center had higher volumes, but they didn't get blamed for the kind of increasing problems in our community because they've been there for 20 years. And so the timing was not coincidental, and that people couldn't point fingers at the Samaritan House.
What's next in all this?
Well, I would imagine that the warming center is probably going to take it to court, because it's basically an extinction level event for them. I don't think they're going to take that sitting down. So I imagine they're going to take it to court. I imagine there'll be a request for an injunction. If they get that injunction, they'll be able to continue to operate until there's a court decision. That could take some time. I'm not sure, maybe a year or more. We'll see. But ultimately, I think that's where it's headed. And again, it's always a guess game of how court cases are going to wind up. But if I would expect that there's a high probability that it will get overturned in court, and then the city will owe the warming center a lot of money.
Whoa. Well, you certainly have enlightened us a lot of things going on behind the scene that we weren't aware of.
We get calls here all the time, and neighbors who are really, really emotional about all this. Mm-hmm. And somehow or another, you guys have got to cut through the emotions of it all, and you've got to make decisions that are good for the city. I'm wondering why, if I were a council member and I were representing any ward but the one that the warming center is in, I'm not sure I would even venture into that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the process was flawed from the start. I think it was absolutely the wrong approach to go about doing it. I think the neighbors, you got to be sympathetic to their situation.
Sure.
You hear the stories of what they were going through, and there are some terrible things that were happening, and it absolutely needs to be addressed. But to go at it through this process of the conditional use permit was the wrong way to go about it. And I think it ultimately was set up for an ending that what we saw really, really tragic and not beneficial, I think, and for anyone. And I want to make that point too, is that if the warming center does close, all those folks who were using the warming center are now going to be out on the street and creating the problems that the neighbors were upset about. Loitering, relieving themselves in public places, passing out in lawns and all this other stuff, all this bad stuff. There's going to be more of that problem. I think there's this myth out there that if the warming center goes away, all these people just disappear and they fade away to other communities. And that's just not the case. The warming center has been clear. They've done surveys. The vast majority of people who come to their facility are locals. They're people who are from here, long-term residents, or they have some sort of connection here, like family, or they came for a job or whatever else. So it makes the situation worse. And unfortunately, if it does go through, I think it will cost lives unnecessarily.
Ryan Hunter, thank you for coming in on short notice and explaining your position and the vote you took. You found yourself at a diametrically different position than the majority of the council members you work with. So it took a lot of thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.